No father, no name anyone's ever heard of. Just you pretending you belong somewhere you clearly don't. 200 people in that ballroom heard him say it. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Josie Calder stood there in a borrowed black dress, 18 years old, suspended from the university that very afternoon on charges she never committed, wearing a tarnished silver pendant this same boy had ripped from her neck 3 weeks earlier and called worthless. She had no father to defend her. Everyone in that room knew it. Then the doors swung open. A motorcade, 2 black sedans, a bulletproof limousine pulling into the courtyard, security fanning out across the marble steps. Music stopped, every head turned, and a silver-haired man in a dark suit walked straight through that crowd, past the trustees, past the donors, past the boy who had just humiliated her, and knelt down in front of her. "My name is Aldrich. I am your father." There are places in this world where you can tell within 30 seconds who belongs and who doesn't. Ashford University was one of those places. Move-in day arrived under a sky the color of old silver. Cars lined the campus drive in a slow gleaming parade. Black SUVs, a cream-colored Bentley, a father in a navy blazer directing movers like a man used to being obeyed. And then there was Josephine Calder. Everyone called her Josie. She stepped off a public bus with a single suitcase and a backpack that had seen better years. No driver, no father in a blazer. Just her standing at the edge of, looking up at the old stone buildings like she was trying to memorize them. She was 18 years old. She had grown up in a small town in Vermont, in a house with a leaking roof and a mother who worked night shifts. She had earned her way here, every single inch of it. She didn't know yet that within the hour a boy named Bradley Whitmore III would try to make her feel small in front of 200 strangers. She didn't know that her silence that day would become the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. Let's start at the beginning. The Ashford University welcome tent stood at the center of campus, white and enormous, snapping gently in the wind. Long tables were covered in name tags and campus maps. Somewhere a brass band played something that sounded like pride. Parents mingled with the parents. Fathers shook hands. Mothers compared notes on dorm room decor. It was in every visible way a celebration of family. Josie walked through it alone. She wasn't embarrassed. Not exactly. She had learned a long time ago that being alone wasn't the same as being weak. But there was a particular kind of loneliness in standing in a crowd built for pairs. She found her name on the check-in table. Calder J. Her fingers brushed over the small silver pendant at her throat, an old habit. Something she did without thinking. It was a simple thing. A disc of tarnished silver, engraved with a pattern she had never quite been able to explain to anyone who asked. Her mother had given it to her the day she left for college. "Keep this close," Eleanor had said, fastening the clasp behind Josie's neck with careful hands. It belonged to someone very important. Someday I'll tell you the whole story. Someday had never quite arrived. Josie had stopped pushing for it years ago. She was still holding the pendant when a voice cut through the crowd, loud enough to turn heads. "Well, would you look at that?" Josie turned. A young man was walking toward her, flanked by 2 friends who already had the easy grins of people who never expected consequences. He was tall, dressed in a fitted quarter zip that probably cost more than Josie's suitcase. His watch caught the afternoon light every time he moved his wrist, like he wanted you to notice. This was Bradley Whitmore III, son of Elliot Whitmore, real estate developer, major donor to Ashford's new athletic center, a man whose name was already on a building somewhere on this campus. Bradley had never had to earn anything in his life. And somehow, that made him worse, not better. "You came by yourself," he said, looking Josie up and down like she was a curiosity. "No driver, no mom, no dad." Josie said nothing. She had learned that silence often did more work than words. But Bradley wasn't finished. "Where is your father exactly?" he asked loud enough for a dozen people nearby to hear. "Or is that one of those questions people don't ask?" A few laughs rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughs, not yet. The uncomfortable kind. The kind people give when they don't know what else to do. Josie felt her face grow warm. She had answered versions of this question her whole life. She had a script for it. something short, something that closed the door without slamming it. "He's not in the picture," she said evenly. "It's just my mom and me." She hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Bradley's eyes lit up the way a bully's eyes light up when they sense an opening. He reached out fast before Josie could react and hooked a finger under the chain of her pendant. He lifted it, examining it like an appraiser at a pawn shop. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, turning it in the light. "Some kind of family crest?" He laughed, and this time his friends laughed harder on cue. "Looks like something you'd find in a gift shop bargain bin. Did your mom buy this to make you feel better about not having a real family?" He let the chain go. It snapped back against Josie's collarbone hard enough to sting. The crowd around them had grown. 20 people, maybe 30. Nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word. This was the moment. This was where a story like this one usually breaks a person or builds them. Josie didn't cry. She didn't shout. She reached up, closed her hand around the pendant, and simply held it for a second, steadying her own breath. Then she looked Bradley directly in the eye. "You don't know anything about my family," she said, quiet but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "And you don't need to. I'm not here to be your entertainment." She turned and walked toward the dormitory, her suitcase wheels clattering over the brick path. Behind her, Bradley called out, "I'm just saying everybody's got a story. I wonder what yours really is." Josie didn't turn around, but something in his voice stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. Here is something important to understand about Josie Calder before we go any further. She was not a girl who avoided conflict because she was afraid of it. She avoided conflict because her mother had taught her from a very young age that some battles are not worth the noise they create, that real strength often looks like stillness, that the people who need to prove they're strong usually aren't. Eleanor Calder had said this to her more than once, usually while stitching a shirt or stirring soup on the stove. Her voice calm, the way it always was, even when their bank account wasn't. "People who are truly powerful," Eleanor once told her, "rarely need to announce it." Josie had believed her mother her whole life. She believed her now, standing in the elevator of her new dormitory, her heart still pounding from the encounter outside. She caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. A tired 18-year-old girl. A worn suitcase, a pendant slightly crooked from being yanked at. She straightened it. "You're okay," she whispered to herself. "You're okay." The elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor. Room 314, her new home for the next 4 years, or however long the scholarship would carry her. Let's go back further just for a moment. Back to Vermont, to the house with the leaking roof, to understand exactly how Josie Calder ended up here. Eleanor Calder raised her daughter alone in a small town called Ashfield Hollow, a name so close to Ashford University that Josie used to joke it was a sign. Eleanor worked night shifts as a nurse at the regional hospital, coming home each morning just as Josie was leaving for school. For years, their entire relationship happened in the gaps. Notes left on the kitchen counter, phone calls during Eleanor's lunch break. Sunday mornings, the one day they were both fully awake at the same time, spent making pancakes and talking about everything and nothing. Josie never remembered asking about her father much. Not because she didn't wonder, but because she could feel, even as a small child, that the question cost her mother something. Every time it came up, something behind Eleanor's eyes would close gently, like a door being pulled shut out of habit rather than anger. "He's not part of our life," Eleanor would say. "But that doesn't mean our life is missing anything." Josie chose over the years to believe her. What Josie did know was this. Her mother had traveled overseas in her 20s before Josie was born, working with an international medical relief organization. Eleanor rarely spoke of those years in detail. There were a few photographs in a shoebox at the top of her closet, faded and curling at the edges. Eleanor, in scrubs, standing in front of buildings Josie didn't recognize. Eleanor, laughing with people whose faces Josie had never learned the names of. And there was the pendant. Eleanor had worn it herself for years, before finally passing it to Josie. She always deflected questions about where it came from with the same soft, tired smile. "Someday," she would say. When you're older. When it matters less and means more. It was a strange thing to say. Josie had never fully understood it. She understood it even less now, standing in her dorm room, still feeling the sting of Bradley's fingers against her collarbone. The acceptance letter to Ashford had arrived on a Tuesday in March. Full scholarship. Tuition, housing, books, all of it covered. Eleanor had read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen counter, before she set it down and pressed both hands flat against her face. "Mom?" Josie had asked, unsure if her mother was crying or laughing. It turned out to be both. "You did this," Eleanor said finally. "All of this is yours. You earned every word on that page." "We did this," Josie corrected her. Eleanor shook her head, smiling through tears that had finally spilled over. "No, sweetheart. This one is yours alone. I just tried to give you enough room to become who you already were." Josie thought about that sentence often. She thought about it now, unpacking her suitcase in room 314, 300 miles from home, surrounded by strangers who had already decided within one afternoon that she didn't belong. She hung her few clothes carefully in the narrow closet made her bed, with the same worn quilt she'd slept under since she was 12, and set a single framed photo of herself and Eleanor on the small desk by the window. The two of them laughing on the porch of their little house in Ashfield Hollow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the unfamiliar room feel just slightly like it belonged to her. She thought about it, and she decided something quietly, the way she decided most things. She would not let one arrogant boy make her small. Not on day one, not ever. Her roommate arrived just after 7 that evening, a quiet, freckled girl named Ruth Anders, hauling a duffel bag twice her size up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had briefly stalled. "You must be Josie," Ruth said, slightly out of breath, setting the bag down with a thud. "I saw your name on the door. I'm sorry I would have knocked, but my hands were kind of full of everything I own." "No apology needed," Josie said, standing to help her with the bag. "Trust me, I understand the struggle." Ruth laughed, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. She was from a small farming town in Ohio, the kind of place, she explained, where everybody knew everybody's business, whether they wanted to or not. "So basically Ashford so far," Josie said dryly. "Oh, you heard already," Ruth said, wincing. "The thing with Whitmore." "Yeah. News moves fast here too, apparently." Josie sighed, sitting back down on her bed. "Word really does travel fast, for what it's worth," Ruth said, unpacking a stack of folded shirts into the dresser. "I thought what you said back was kind of perfect. Short. Didn't give him anything to work with. My grandmother always says the quickest way to lose an argument with a fool is to keep arguing." "Smart grandmother," Josie said. "She raised 5 kids on a dairy farm alone after my grandfather passed," Ruth said. "She's earned the right to be smart." Something in that sentence settled gently into Josie's chest. A woman raising a family alone. A woman who had earned her wisdom the hard way, through years nobody else had witnessed. It sounded in some small way like her own mother. They spent the rest of the evening arranging their half of the small room, trading stories about home, laughing more than either of them expected to on a day that had started so poorly. By the time the lights went out, Josie found herself feeling for the first time since stepping off that bus something close to steady ground. Not everyone at Ashford wanted to make her feel small. Some people, it turned out, simply wanted to make room. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed under an unfamiliar ceiling, Josie called her mother. Eleanor picked up on the second ring, the way she always did, as if she'd been waiting with the phone in her hand. "How was it?" Eleanor asked. "Tell me everything." Josie hesitated. She thought about leaving out the part with Bradley. She thought about protecting her mother from one more small cruelty in a life that had already absorbed so many, but she had never been good at hiding things from Eleanor, not really. "There was a guy," Josie said finally. "Rich kid. He said some stuff about me not having a dad. Grabbed at my necklace, called it fake." There was a pause on the line, a long one. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked, and her voice had changed just slightly. Tighter, careful. "I'm fine, Mom." I didn't let him get to me. Much. Good, Eleanor said. Good girl. Another pause. Mom, Josie said slowly, why does that necklace matter so much to you? She heard her mother exhale long and slow, the way she did when she was choosing her words with more care than usual. It matters, Eleanor said, because it's proof of something I never got to finish telling you. Finish it now, Josie said. I'm 18. I think I can handle it. Not on the phone, Eleanor said gently. Not like this. I promise you, Josie, when the time is right, I will tell you everything. Every single piece of it. You always say that? I know, Eleanor said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly. Something Josie had rarely heard before. And I mean it more than you know. They talked a little longer about smaller things, the way people do when a conversation has gotten too heavy too quickly. And both sides need somewhere softer to land. Josie hung up feeling more unsettled than before she called, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She lay awake a long time that night, turning the pendant over and over between her fingers in the dark. The first week of classes moved fast the way they always do, a blur of syllabi and building numbers, and searching for lecture halls that seemed to move overnight. Bradley Whitmore did not let the incident from move-in day fade quietly the way Josie had hoped it might. He seemed to enjoy having a new target, someone whose composure he hadn't quite managed to crack yet. It became in some strange way a game to him. He started small, comments in passing. A remark about her second-hand backpack loud enough for a hallway to hear. And then on Tuesday afternoon, something more organized. Their shared economics seminar met in a smaller room at 20 students seated around a long oval table. Bradley sat near the head of it, the way he sat everywhere, like the room had been arranged around him ahead of time. The assignment was simple. Small groups. A short presentation on market inefficiencies. Josie had been placed by pure bad luck in Bradley's group. He hadn't done any of the reading. That much was obvious within the first 2 minutes. He leaned back in his chair, spinning a pen between 2 fingers, letting the rest of the group carry the conversation. When it came time to divide the work, he looked directly at Josie. You handle the numbers part, Chan, he said. Scholarship kids are usually good at that, all that extra tutoring you people get. A few students exchanged glances. Nobody laughed this time. It wasn't funny enough to laugh at. It was just uncomfortable. Josie kept her voice level. I'll take the numbers because I'm good with numbers, not because of anything else. Sure, Bradley said, smiling like he'd won something small. Whatever helps you sleep at night. The professor, distracted by his own laptop, didn't seem to notice any of it. Josie finished her portion of the project that night alone in the library, well past the point where it was technically her responsibility. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was used to carrying more than her share. It still stung in a small, quiet way that lingered longer than she expected. By Wednesday, a rumor had started circulating in her dorm, one Maddie brought to her with an apologetic wince over breakfast. Maddie lived down the hall, a girl with short, dark hair and a talent for making bad news sound survivable. They had met at dinner on the very first night, when Maddie dropped her tray across from Josie's and simply announced herself, no invitation needed. People are saying your mom ran off from some rich guy or something, Maddie said now, over eggs neither of them was eating. That she's hiding from somebody. I don't know where it started, but I have a pretty solid guess. Josie's jaw tightened. Let me guess. Yep, Maddie said. Whitmore's crew. I'm sorry, Josie. It's stupid and it's not true, but it's the kind of thing people repeat because it's more interesting than the truth, whatever the truth actually is. The truth, Josie said carefully, is that my mom worked overseas for a couple of years before I was born. That's it. That's the whole scandal. Maddie held up both hands. Hey, you don't have to convince me. I just wanted you to know what's going around so it doesn't blindside you. Josie appreciated that more than she said. Still, the rumor bothered her more than she expected. Not because of what it said about her. Because of what it implied about Eleanor, a woman who had worked double shifts for 18 years to give her daughter a life without wanting for anything. Being reduced to a punchline whispered in dormitory hallways by people who had never met her. That afternoon, in her assigned seat in European history, Josie found it harder than usual to concentrate. Professor Lindholm was not the kind of teacher students expected to enjoy. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, precise in a way that bordered on old-fashioned. He wore the same 3 tweed jackets in rotation and had a habit of pausing mid-sentence to consider his own words more carefully, as if lectures deserved the same rigor as scholarship. Most students found him dry. Josie found him oddly comforting. There was something steady about a man who cared that much about getting small details right. That Wednesday, his lecture moved through the smaller monarchies of post-war Europe, tracing how several tiny nations had quietly rebuilt themselves in the shadows of larger, louder powers. One of the more interesting cases, Lindholm said, walking slowly along the front of the room, is the Kingdom of Aldheim, a small constitutional monarchy nestled along the northern coast, often overlooked in survey courses like this one, though its royal family has an unusually long and frankly unusually private history. He clicked to the next, a faded photograph of a stone palace overlooking gray water. Their coronation traditions, he continued, are among the oldest in northern Europe. The reigning monarch is required by long-standing custom to greet each new heir, not standing, but kneeling, a gesture meant to remind the crown that it serves the people, not the other way around. He paused, glancing at his notes. It's a small detail easy to overlook, but I've always found it. Actually, Josie said before she fully realized she was speaking. It's not a coronation tradition. It's a birth acknowledgement. The kneeling happens the first time the monarch meets the child, not during the coronation itself. The coronation ceremony uses a different gesture, an open palm placed over the heart. The room went quiet. Professor Lindholm turned to look at her, his expression shifting from mild surprise into something sharper, more focused. That's remarkably specific, Miss Calder, he said slowly. Where did you come across that detail? It's not in any of the standard texts. Frankly, I only know it myself because of a research trip I took 15 years ago. Josie blinked. She genuinely didn't have an answer. I don't know, she said honestly, feeling suddenly uncomfortably exposed. It just came out. I don't remember learning it anywhere specific. A few students laughed lightly, assuming she was joking. Josie let them believe that. It was easier than trying to explain something she didn't understand herself, but Professor Lindholm didn't laugh. He studied her for one long moment, the way a man studies a puzzle piece that has landed somewhere. It shouldn't quite fit, and then he nodded slowly and continued the lecture as if nothing unusual had happened. Josie spent the rest of class only half listening, her mind circling back to the strange, effortless certainty of what she'd just said. She had never studied Aldheim. She had never, as far as she remembered, even heard the name before that lecture. So why had it felt for one brief second less like recalling a fact and more like remembering something she had once simply known? After class, Professor Lindholm asked her to stay behind for a moment. He waited until the room had emptied before speaking, his voice quieter than it had been during the lecture. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, he said. But that detail about Aldheim, truly very few historians outside that region know it. May I ask, has your family any connection to Northern Europe? Any relatives, perhaps, who lived or worked there? Josie thought of the shoebox of photographs in her mother's closet. The faces she'd never learned the names of. My mom worked overseas for a while, she said carefully. Before I was born. I don't know exactly where. Something shifted behind Lindholm's eyes, quick and thoughtful there, and then carefully tucked away. I see, he said. Well, it's probably nothing. An interesting coincidence, that's all. But his tone didn't quite match his words. He was, Josie noticed, an academic through and through, the kind of man who found genuine coincidences irritating rather than charming, and who tended quietly to go looking for the explanation underneath them. He said goodbye with a kind of gentle formality that felt to Josie oddly deliberate, the way people speak when they are choosing not to say something else entirely. She walked back to her dorm, turning the exchange over in her mind, unable to shake the sense that she had touched, however briefly, some part of a story much larger than a college lecture hall. She had no way of knowing that Professor Lindholm returned to his office that same evening and spent nearly 2 hours searching through old academic journals, cross-referencing the exact wording she had used against the handful of scholarly sources that existed on Aldheim's private royal customs. Nor did she know that by the time he finally turned off his desk lamp well past midnight, his curiosity had hardened into something closer to a quiet, careful suspicion. Not every important character in this story announces themselves right away. Some simply appear quietly at the edges of everyday life, long before anyone understands why they matter. For Josie, that person was Walter Higgins. Higgins worked as the head of campus grounds and security at the north entrance. A broad-shouldered man somewhere in his early 70s, with a gray crew cut and a way of standing that suggested decades of discipline nobody had ever bothered to erase. He had worked at Ashford for almost 20 years, long enough that most students simply called him Mr. Higgins, out of a respect that seemed to arrive automatically without needing to be earned twice. Josie first noticed him on her second night at Ashford, walking back from the library, later than she meant to, her arms full of textbooks. He was standing near the north gate doing his usual evening rounds when he spotted her coming down the path alone. "Bit late for a young lady to be walking by herself," he said, his voice low and even, not unkind, simply observant. "Campus is safe enough, but I like knowing where our newest arrivals are landing at night." "I lost track of time in the library," Josie admitted. "First week chaos." Higgins nodded slowly, studying her for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. "You're the Calder girl," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Josie hesitated. "Word travels fast around here." "Small campus," Higgins said simply. "News moves faster than the weather." He paused, glancing briefly at the pendant resting against her collarbone, half hidden beneath her scarf. Something flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "That's a fine piece you're wearing," he said finally. "Old craftsmanship. You don't see work like that much anymore." Josie touched it instinctively. "It was my mother's." "I imagine it means a great deal to her then," Higgins said. "Things like that usually do." There was something in the way he said it, barren and almost reverent, that made Josie pause. "Do you know something about it?" she asked, half joking, half genuinely curious. Higgins smiled, a small, unreadable smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know a lot of things, Miss Calder," he said. "Comes with getting old. Get home safe now. Straight there, no detours." He turned and continued his rounds before she could ask anything further. Josie stood there a moment longer, watching him walk away under the amber glow of the streetlights. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, that reminded her of old photographs of soldiers standing at ease. She had seen that same posture somewhere before, though she couldn't quite place it. She thought about calling after him. She didn't. Instead, she walked the rest of the way to her dorm, turning the strange little exchange over in her mind, the second such moment in one single day. First Professor Lindholm, now Higgins. Two older men on the very same afternoon, reacting to small pieces of her life as though they recognized something she couldn't see herself. She told herself it was nothing. Coincidence. The kind of thing a tired mind builds into a pattern that doesn't actually exist. She almost believed it. What Josie could not have known, standing alone in the dark that night, was that Walter Higgins had recognized the pendant the very first evening he saw it back on move-in day, watching quietly from a distance as Bradley Whitmore yanked it from her neck. He had said nothing that day. He had gone home instead, sat alone at his kitchen table until well past midnight, and stared at an old photograph he kept folded inside his wallet. He had not looked at in a very long time. By the end of the first week, something had begun to shift quietly on campus. Something Josie didn't fully register until later, looking back. It happened during a mandatory freshman fitness orientation, held in the university's aging gymnasium, a required rite of passage nobody particularly enjoyed. Students were split into small groups, running through basic drills under the mild supervision of two exhausted graduate assistants. Bradley Whitmore predictably had turned the exercise into a performance showing off for a small cluster of admirers near the climbing wall. It was during a relay exercise that things went wrong. A fellow freshman named Grant Colby, sprinting too fast across a section of newly waxed floor, lost his footing entirely. He went down hard, his arm twisting beneath him at an angle that made several students gasp and look away. For one long second, nobody moved. The graduate assistant stood frozen, unsure, phones already half raised, to call for help. Josie moved before she consciously decided to. She crossed the gym floor in seconds, dropping to her knees beside Grant, her hands already working before her mind had fully caught up to what they were doing. "Don't move your arm," she said, her voice calm, clear, startlingly authoritative for an 18-year-old freshman. "Keep it exactly where it is. I need you to breathe slowly for me, okay? In through your nose." She checked his pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers, steady and practiced. She examined the angle of the injury without touching it directly, her eyes narrowing slightly, the way a much older, much more experienced person's might. "It's not broken," she said after a moment, more to herself than to anyone else. "Dislocated, most likely. We need to keep it immobilized until the trainer gets here. Does anyone have something I can use as a sling, a jacket, a towel, anything?" Someone handed her a hoodie. Josie folded it with quick, efficient movements and fashioned a makeshift support, talking Grant through slow breaths the entire time, her voice never once wavering. By the time the campus medical trainer arrived, 4 minutes later, Josie had already stabilized the injury almost perfectly. The trainer knelt beside Grant, checked his arm, and looked up at Josie with open surprise. "This is textbook," she said. "Exactly right. Where did you learn to do this?" Josie sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on her. Aware of Bradley standing at the edge of the crowd, his earlier performance forgotten, his expression unreadable. "My mom's a nurse," Josie said simply. "She used to practice this stuff on me at the kitchen table, in case I ever needed it." It was true as far as it went, but even as she said it, Josie felt the strange gap between the explanation and the reality of what had just happened. She hadn't thought about the steps. She hadn't hesitated or guessed or improvised the way a person does when they're recalling something secondhand. Her hands had simply known. The trainer thanked her, praised her twice more, and eventually helped Grant to his feet to walk him toward the health center. The small crowd of students slowly dispersed, whispering among themselves. Maddie appeared at Josie's side, eyes wide. "Okay, that was insane," she said. "You just doctored that kid on the spot. Where did that come from?" "I told you," Josie said. "My mom's a nurse." "Sure," Maddie said, clearly unconvinced, but choosing not to push. "Nurse's kid vibes. Got it." Across the gym, Bradley watched the scene with narrowed eyes, arms crossed over his chest. He had spent the last week trying in small and petty ways to remind Josie Calder exactly where she stood on the social ladder of Ashford University. Beneath him, beneath his friends, beneath anyone whose family name appeared on a building somewhere on campus. Instead, in the space of 10 minutes, she had become something else entirely in front of 24 witnesses. Impressive. That word landed in Bradley's mind like an insult aimed directly at him. He didn't like it. Not one bit. That same Friday evening, Josie sat cross-legged on her bed, still faintly rattled from the attention the gymnasium incident had brought her, while Ruth graded a stack of practice flashcards for an upcoming biology quiz at her desk nearby. "Can I ask you something?" Josie said, staring at the ceiling. "Do you ever feel like people decide who you are before they actually know you?" Ruth set down her flashcards. "Every single day, probably. I'm the farm girl from Ohio who everyone assumes doesn't know what a subway is. You're the scholarship girl everyone assumes has some tragic backstory worth gossiping about. People love a story more than they love the truth. Doesn't mean the story's accurate." "It's exhausting," Josie admitted. "Correcting people. Or not correcting them and just letting them believe whatever's easier." "For what it's worth," Ruth said. "I don't think you owe anybody an explanation. Not Bradley Whitmore, not the girls in the dining hall who keep staring, not anyone. You get to decide who you are. Everyone else is just guessing." Josie turned that thought over for a long moment. It was the kind of sentence she suspected she'd remember longer than she expected to. The way certain small pieces of advice have a way of outlasting the moment they were given. "You should write greeting cards," Josie said, finally smiling despite herself. "I contain multitudes," Ruth said solemnly, returning to her flashcards. They fell into a comfortable quiet after that. The kind of quiet that only exists between people who have decided, without ever really discussing it, that they trust each other. Josie thought about her mother's night shifts, about 18 years of Eleanor, deciding again and again who she was going to be, regardless of what anyone assumed about her. She thought about Higgins and his careful, knowing eyes. She thought about Professor Lindholm and the strange, unplaceable certainty she'd felt reciting facts she shouldn't have known. None of it made sense yet. But for the first time since arriving at Ashford, Josie found she wasn't afraid of not having the answers right away. Some things she was beginning to learn simply needed time to reveal themselves. That evening, Bradley sat alone in his oversized single dorm room, the kind reserved for students whose families funded entire renovation projects, scrolling absently through his phone without really seeing it. His mind kept circling back to the gymnasium, to the calm, practiced way Josie Calder had knelt beside Grant Colby, giving orders like someone twice her age, to the murmur of admiration that had rippled through the room. Afterward admiration Bradley usually reserved exclusively for himself. I thought about the necklace, too. The strange tarnished silver disc she wore, like it was precious, though it looked to his eye like something bought at a flea market for $10. Something about all of it itched at him, small and persistent, the way an unanswered question always does to a person who has never learned patience. He picked up his phone and called his father. Elliot Whitmore answered on the third ring, his voice already impatient, the sound of a business dinner audible faintly in the background. "Make it quick, Bradley. I'm in the middle of something." "There's a girl in my year," Bradley said, keeping his tone casual, almost bored. "Scholarship kid. Called her. Something's off about her." "Off how?" Elliot asked, only half listening. "I don't know exactly," Bradley admitted. "She acts like she's better than everyone. Corrected a professor today about some obscure European royal family word for word like she'd memorized it. Then she pulled off some hero act in gym class, like she's been trained for it her whole life." There was a pause on the line. Elliot Whitmore had not built a real estate empire by ignoring small, strange details. He had built it precisely by noticing the ones other people dismissed. "What's her full name?" Elliot asked, his tone shifting, sharpening slightly. "Josephine Calder," Bradley said. "Goes by Josie." "And the mother?" "Eleanor, I think. Some nurse from Vermont. Nobody important." "Everybody's somebody, Bradley," Elliot said. "That's usually the mistake people make, assuming otherwise." "So you'll look into it?" Bradley asked, a small, satisfied smile already forming. "I have people for things like this," Elliot said simply. "Consider it handled. In the meantime, do try not to embarrass the family name any further this week. I hear you made quite a scene on move-in day." "She deserved it," Bradley said flatly. "I'm sure she did," Elliot said, in the tone of a man who had stopped listening several sentences ago. "Good night, Bradley." The call ended. Bradley set his phone down on the desk and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, that small itch of unease finally quieting, replaced by something closer to satisfaction. He didn't know yet what his father's investigators would find. He didn't know that somewhere across campus, an old campus security guard had already begun quietly reaching out to old contacts, moved not by jealousy, but by a debt he had carried for 18 years toward a woman he had once been proud to call a friend. I didn't know that the girl he had humiliated on move-in day was about to become, in every sense of the word, the most consequential person he would ever meet. All he knew lying in his dorm room that night was that Josephine Calder had gotten under his skin. And Bradley Whitmore III did not like feeling small. Not even for a second. Not even by a girl who arrived on a public bus carrying one suitcase and a pendant she didn't yet understand the true value of. Somewhere 300 miles north, in a small kitchen in Ashfield Hollow, Eleanor Calder sat alone at her table long after finishing her tea, the phone from her earlier conversation with Josie still resting in her hand. She hadn't told her daughter everything. Not yet. She had promised herself years ago that Josie would learn the full truth when the time was right, not a moment before, not a moment after. But listening to her daughter describe the boy who had grabbed her necklace, mocked her for growing up without a father, Eleanor had felt something old stir inside her, something she had spent 18 years trying to keep gently, carefully buried. She rose from the table and walked to her bedroom closet, reaching to the very top shelf where a small wooden box sat behind a stack of folded sweaters. Inside, beneath a handful of old photographs, lay a folded letter, its paper soft with age, its ink slightly faded. She had never sent it. She unfolded it now for the first time in years and read the opening line by the dim light of her bedside lamp. "My dearest, if you are reading this, it means I finally found the courage." Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment. "Not yet," she whispered to the empty room, as if speaking to someone who might somehow still hear her. "Just a little longer. Let her find her own strength first." She folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside the box, and closed the lid. Outside her window, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the quiet, patient promise of a story that had waited 18 years to be told and was at long last beginning to stir. Back at Ashford, the first week ended quietly enough on the surface. Classes settled into rhythm. The gossip about Josie began slowly to fade into the background noise of a busy campus. But underneath that surface, two separate threads had already begun to pull tight, without either man fully realizing how closely they would soon be woven together. Professor Lindholm spent his evenings that week returning again and again to the strange precision of a comment made by an 18-year-old freshman who claimed she didn't know where she'd learned it. And Walter Higgins, standing alone at the North Gate late one evening, allowed himself for the first time in 18 years to say a name out loud that he had promised himself he would never speak on this campus again. It was a small word, barely more than a breath in the cold night air. But some words carry more weight than their size would suggest, and this one was about to change everything. If there is one thing worth remembering from this first week of Josie Calder's story, it is this. Dignity does not require an audience. It does not need applause or witnesses or proof. Josie could have shouted back at Bradley Whitmore on that first afternoon. She could have matched his cruelty with cruelty of her own. Plenty of people would have understood if she had. Instead, she chose stillness. She chose the quieter, harder path of simply refusing to be diminished, even when nobody was defending her, even when the crowd around her stayed silent. That kind of quiet strength rarely gets noticed right away. It builds slowly, the way trust builds, the way respect builds, one small moment at a time, until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. Somewhere in Vermont, a mother who had spent 18 years choosing patience over shortcuts understood that better than anyone. And somewhere on that campus, an old groundskeeper and a careful professor, each moving independently, each unaware of exactly how close the other one already stood, to the same buried truth, were about to discover that the past does not stay buried forever. Sometimes it simply waits, quietly, patiently, for the right young woman to walk across a quad wearing an old pendant she never asked for, refusing to let a stranger's cruelty decide her worth. And once that kind of quiet courage sets something back into motion, there is very little in this world capable of stopping it. Some stories move slowly at first, then all at once they don't. By the start of week 2, Josie Calder had settled into a rhythm at Ashford. Classes in the morning, study sessions with Ruth in the evening, quiet dinners with Maddie, who had a talent for making even a bad day feel survivable. She thought the worst of it was behind her. She had no way of knowing that a team of paid investigators had already opened a file with her mother's name on it. She had no way of knowing that the quiet, ordinary shape of her life was about to be pulled apart piece by piece by people who had never once bothered to learn who she actually was. This is where the real trouble begins. Elliot Whitmore did not waste time on things that didn't matter to him. But his son's phone call had planted a small seed of curiosity. And Elliot had built his fortune on following curiosity wherever it led, especially when reputation was involved. He assigned the matter to a private research firm. Quiet work, discreet, the kind of investigation that left no footprints. The report came back within 4 days. Elliot read it twice at his desk. A glass of scotch sat untouched beside his laptop. Eleanor Calder, registered nurse, no criminal record, 18 years of steady work at a regional hospital in Vermont. Then tucked into page 3 a 2-year gap. In her early 20s, Eleanor Calder had worked overseas. She'd joined an international medical relief group called Continental Aid Corps. The records were sparse. Locations were listed only by region. Personnel files from that era were only partly digitized. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't even very interesting. But Elliot Whitmore had learned something over 3 decades in business. Gaps like this one were useful in a specific way. Not because they proved anything, because they created doubt. And doubt, in his experience, was often stronger than truth. He called Bradley. "I looked into your scholarship, girl," he said without any greeting. "And?" Bradley asked, sitting up straighter. "Nothing you can use directly," Elliot said. "Nurse. Clean record. Worked abroad a couple of years before you were born. Some medical charity thing. Nothing scandalous." Bradley's shoulders sagged. "So that's it, dead end." "I didn't say that," Elliot said. His voice was calm, almost amused. "I said there's nothing you can use directly. There's a difference." "What does that mean?" "It means people don't need facts to believe something," Elliot said slowly. "They just need a good enough story, and someone willing to tell it." Bradley smiled slowly into the phone. "So what's the story?" "Leave that part to me," Elliot said. "You focus on keeping this girl visible, vulnerable. I'll handle the rest." He hung up before Bradley could ask anything else. Elliot sat alone in his office a while longer. He turned the folder over in his hands, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He didn't think of Josie Calder as a person in that moment. He thought of her as a variable. A small, inconvenient variable standing between his son's comfort and his own business interests. He had no idea how wrong that assumption would prove to be. Josie's scholarship carried a specific name. She had always been quietly proud of it. The Hartwell Family Veterans Legacy Scholarship. It had been established 2 decades earlier by a wealthy alumnus. He named it in honor of his father, a decorated veteran who struggled for years to afford a college after returning home. The fund supported a small number of students each year, chosen not for athletic ability or family connections, but for financial need and academic promise. Josie had cried the day she learned she'd received it. Not because of the money, though the money mattered enormously. Because of what it represented. Someone had once decided that people without wealth still deserved a real chance. She wore that scholarship like a quiet badge of honor. She had no idea it was about to become the exact weapon used against her. Eleanor Calder arrived at Ashford on a gray Saturday, 3 weeks into the semester. She had saved 2 months of extra shifts to afford the bus ticket and 1 night at a modest inn near campus. She wanted to see where her daughter was living, to see the buildings, to sit even briefly inside the life Josie had built. Josie met her at the campus entrance, and the moment she saw her mother's tired, kind face, something in her chest loosened. "You look wonderful," Eleanor said, holding her daughter's face in both hands. "College suits you." "I missed you," Josie said simply. They spent the morning walking the campus together. Josie pointed out buildings, classrooms, the library, where she'd already spent too many late nights. Eleanor listened to every word like it mattered more than anything else in the world. It was, for a while, exactly the kind of ordinary happy morning mothers and daughters are supposed to share. It didn't stay that way. They were crossing the main quad, heading toward lunch, when Bradley Whitmore appeared. He was flanked by 2 friends still dressed in team gear from practice. He spotted Josie first, then Eleanor beside her. Something sharp and delighted crossed his face. "Well, look who it is," Bradley said, slowing down deliberately. "Josie Calder, and I'm guessing the famous mystery mother." Eleanor's expression stayed calm, but Josie felt her mother's hand tighten around her arm. "You must be Bradley," Eleanor said evenly. "Josie's mentioned you." "Only good things, I hope," Bradley said, grinning at his friends. "She's mentioned you," Eleanor repeated, "which I think speaks for itself." A few students nearby laughed quietly. Bradley's grin flickered just slightly before he recovered it. "I've heard some interesting things about you, too," he said, his tone sharper now. "My father's been digging a little. 2 mysterious years overseas, no explanations. Makes a person wonder what you were really doing out there. Bradley, Josie said, her voice hard. That's enough. I'm just curious, Bradley pressed, ignoring her. Was it a relief mission, or were you running from something? People don't hide 2 years of their life unless there's something worth hiding. The words landed like small, precise blows. Josie watched something flicker across her mother's face. Not anger exactly. Something closer to old, careful pain. My past, Eleanor said quietly, is none of your business, young man. Everything's my business, Bradley. Bradley shot back, real heat entering his voice now. When it involves the girl embarrassing my family at every turn. You people act like you deserve to be treated like everyone else when nobody even knows who you really are. That was the moment something in Josie finally cracked, not into rage, into something steadier and colder. She stepped forward, placing herself between Bradley and her mother. You don't get to talk to her like that, Josie said low, but absolutely unwavering. You can say whatever you want about me. I can handle it. But she has worked harder than you will ever understand. She raised me alone. She gave me everything I have. You don't get to question her worth because you're bored and looking for someone to feel superior to. The quad had gone quiet around them. A small crowd had gathered. Bradley opened his mouth, then seemed to think better of it. He glanced at the growing audience, some of whom now watched him with clear discomfort. Whatever, he muttered, finally waving a dismissive hand. Enjoy your little family reunion. He walked away with his friends. His usual confidence looked, for the first time since Josie had met him, slightly rattled. Eleanor exhaled slowly once he was gone, one hand pressed briefly against her chest. I'm so sorry, Josie said, turning to her mother. I should have warned you about him. Don't apologize, Eleanor said, though her voice shook slightly. You did nothing wrong. Neither did I. He had no right, Josie said, anger still simmering underneath her calm. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the direction Bradley had disappeared. Someday, she said softly, almost to herself. Boys like that learn exactly how small their cruelty makes them. It just usually takes longer than any of us would like. They finished the visit trying to recapture the morning's warmth and mostly succeeding. But something had shifted underneath the surface for both of them. Neither of them yet understood how close that shift was to becoming something much larger. That same evening, a quieter conversation was taking place across campus, one that would matter far more than either Josie or Eleanor could guess. Walter Higgins finished his final round and found Professor Lindholm exactly where he expected, in his small, cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of papers and the particular smell of old coffee that seemed to live permanently in that building. Higgins knocked once, then let himself in without waiting. You've been asking questions, Higgins said, closing the door behind him. About the Calder girl. Lindholm looked up, startled, then slowly set down his pen. He had spent most of the past 2 weeks in the quiet hours after his classes ended, working through old academic journals and archived correspondence, trying to understand exactly how an 18-year-old freshman from Vermont could recite a detail about Aldheim's royal customs that existed almost nowhere in print. You know something, Lindholm said. It wasn't a question. Higgins lowered himself into the chair across the desk, moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose joints remembered decades of hard use. I know a great deal, Higgins said quietly. More than I ever meant to share with anyone on this campus. Lindholm leaned forward. Then I think it's time you did. I'm you. Higgins was quiet for a moment. His gaze drifted somewhere far beyond the office walls. Before I came here, he said finally, I served for many years in a coordination unit. I worked alongside international humanitarian missions. My job was logistics, security, keeping aid workers safe in difficult regions. Continental Aid Corps, Lindholm said slowly. That name has come up more than once in my own reading these past 2 weeks. Higgins nodded once. I was assigned to a mission in the early years of that program. A small team working closely with a delegation from a northern European kingdom. They supported relief efforts under a great deal of secrecy. Aldheim, Lindholm said barely above a whisper. Aldheim, Higgins confirmed. The room felt suddenly smaller. The air felt heavier. There was a young man on that mission. Higgins continued, his voice growing quieter. Traveling under a false name, though most of us in leadership knew exactly who he was. Second in line to the Aldheim throne at the time. He'd insisted on working in the field himself against his own family's wishes. He believed a future monarch owed something real to the people he would one day lead. And Eleanor Calder, Lindholm said, beginning to understand, was one of the nurses on the same mission, Higgins said. Young, brilliant, utterly unimpressed by titles or crowns, which is exactly why he fell for her as quickly as he did. Lindholm sat back slowly, the pieces of an impossible puzzle finally aligning. They fell in love, Higgins said simply, quietly, carefully. The way people do when they both understand the world will eventually try to pull them apart. What happened? Lindholm asked. The palace happened, Higgins said, old bitterness entering his voice. Word reached Aldheim's royal council. Their future king was involved with an American nurse of no noble standing. Succession laws at the time were rigid. Marriage outside a narrow approved circle would have stripped him of his place entirely. So they separated them, Lindholm said. Eleanor was quietly reassigned before either of them understood what was happening, Higgins said. By the time she realized she was pregnant, the mission had already ended. She made the decision herself, not to contact him. She told me once, the last time we spoke, that she refused to force a choice between his country and his child. Lindholm sat in stunned silence, absorbing everything. You've known this, he said finally, this whole time, since Josie arrived here. I suspected it the very first evening I saw her, Higgins said. Move-in day. I watched that boy tear the pendant from her neck, and I recognized the pattern before he'd even finished laughing about it. I went home that night and sat at my own kitchen table until well past midnight, looking at a photograph I hadn't looked at in a very long while. Why haven't you said anything until now? Lindholm asked. Because it was never mine to say, Higgins said firmly. Eleanor made her choice for good reasons. I respected it, even after all these years. I only decided to speak because that boy is dragging her name through the mud on this campus, and I refused to stand by while a woman who sacrificed everything for her daughter gets torn apart by a spoiled child who understands nothing about real sacrifice. Lindholm nodded slowly, resolve settling into his features. Then we need to be careful, he said, and we need to move quickly. Agreed, Higgins said. There are people at the Aldheim consulate in the city. They would want to know what's happening here, discreetly, before things escalate further. I have a former colleague, Lindholm said, already turning toward his computer. She worked briefly as a cultural liaison for the Aldheim royal court years ago. If anyone can open the right door quietly, it's her. Before Lindholm began typing, Higgins sat quietly a moment longer, his hands resting on his knees. Can I tell you something else? Higgins said, before we go any further with this. Lindholm paused, waiting. When I came home from my own years of service, Higgins said, long before any of this, nobody much noticed. No parades, no fuss. I came back, found a job sweeping floors at a hardware store, and spent a long while feeling like the country I'd given so much to had already moved on without me. I didn't know that, Lindholm said quietly. Most people don't ask. Higgins said without bitterness, simply stating a fact he'd made peace with long ago. It was Eleanor, actually all those years later, who used to remind me that service doesn't need an audience to matter. She believed that all the way down to her bones. I think her daughter believes it too, whether she knows where it comes from or not. He stood slowly, steadying himself against the edge of the desk. That's part of why I'm doing this, he said. Not just for the truth about her father. For the debt I still owe a woman who once sat with a lonely old groundskeeper on his worst nights and never once made him feel forgotten. Lindholm said nothing for a moment, simply nodding, understanding settling quietly between them. Then he turned back to his computer fingers, finding the keys. That night, working late, the two men drafted a careful message. one that revealed only enough truth to be taken seriously without exposing Josie or Eleanor to unnecessary risk. Neither of them knew how urgently it would soon be needed. 3 days after Eleanor's visit, Elliot Whitmore's plan moved into its next phase. He had decided exactly how to damage Josie Calder's standing at Ashford, without ever directly implicating his own family. The Hartwell Veterans Legacy Scholarship Fund was managed through a small university financial office. A part-time administrator oversaw it. An outside auditor reviewed it twice yearly. It was by design an informal system built on trust rather than heavy bureaucracy. Exactly the kind of system that could be quietly exploited. Elliot arranged through an intermediary, with no visible connection to his own name, for a small pattern of falsified financial discrepancies to appear in the fund's recent records. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw immediate attention. Just enough irregularity timed precisely around Josie's enrollment to suggest scholarship funds meant for multiple veteran-connected students had been quietly redirected toward one recipient's personal expenses. Josie Calder's name sat directly at the center of it. It was in every sense a lie, built with surgical precision. Constructed almost entirely out of half-truths and carefully edited documents. Just plausible enough to survive a first glance. By the following Monday, the university's Financial Oversight Office had flagged the irregularities. Policy required them to forward the file directly to the Scholarship Committee for review. Josie had no idea any of this was happening. She spent that week focused on midterms, on late nights in the library with Ruth, on small ordinary victories, a strong grade on a history paper, a good conversation with Maddie over burnt dining hall coffee. For the first time since arriving at Ashford, life had started to feel almost normal. That fragile normalcy ended on a Thursday afternoon. She received an email requesting her presence at a mandatory meeting with the Office of Financial Aid the following week. The subject line read simply, regarding scholarship compliance review. Josie read it 3 times before the words fully registered. She called her mother that night, her voice tight with confusion and a fear she couldn't quite name. They said something about irregularities in the scholarship fund, Josie said, pacing the small dorm room. Ruth watched with quiet concern from her desk. I don't understand, Mom. I haven't done anything wrong. I know you haven't, Eleanor said immediately firmly. There has to be some kind of mistake. A clerical error, maybe? What if it's not a mistake? Josie asked, the fear finally breaking through. What if someone did this on purpose? There was a pause on the line. Josie could hear her mother's breath change slightly. The particular quiet of someone thinking very carefully before speaking. Josie, Eleanor said slowly, I need you to listen very carefully. Whatever happens in that meeting, whatever they say to you, stay calm. Stay honest. Don't let anyone shake your certainty about who you are and what you've earned. You're scaring me a little, Josie admitted quietly. I don't mean to, Eleanor said. I just need you to trust that you have never done anything to be ashamed of. Do you understand me? I understand, Josie said, though the fear in her chest hadn't fully loosened. She hung up that night, feeling for the first time at Ashford genuinely unsteady. Not because of anything Bradley had said or done directly, because of something far more serious now, standing at the edge of her future. The next morning, still shaken, Josie found herself outside the campus counseling center almost without deciding to go there. She had never used the service before. She'd always told herself she didn't need it, that she'd learned to carry her own weight a long time ago. But standing in the hallway that morning, staring at the frosted glass door, she felt for once too tired to carry anything alone. A woman named Dr. Patterson greeted her warmly gray-haired, soft-spoken, with the kind of patient eyes that seemed to have absorbed decades of other people's worries without ever growing hardened by them. You look like someone carrying more than she should have to, Dr. Patterson said, gently closing the office door. Josie told her everything. The scholarship review. Bradley. The strange mounting fear that something bigger than a simple misunderstanding was unfolding around her. Dr. Patterson listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, letting the silence do its own quiet work. I want to tell you something, she said finally, once Josie had run out of words. In my experience, the people who survive moments like this best aren't the ones who never feel afraid. They're the ones who let themselves feel the fear fully. and then choose their next action anyway, deliberately, instead of letting the fear choose it for them. "What if my next action doesn't matter?" Josie asked quietly. "What if it's already decided?" "Then you still get to decide who you are while it happens," Dr. Patterson said. "That part nobody can take from you. Not a committee, not a boy with too much money and too little character. That part is yours no matter what they decide." Josie left that office with her fears still present, but somehow lighter, easier to carry. She thought about Dr. Patterson's words more than once over the following days, returning to them the way a person returns to a steady handrail on an unfamiliar staircase. The scholarship committee met the following Monday. It was chaired by a woman named Constance Whitfield, a longtime Ashford administrator known across campus for her fairness and her exhausting attention to detail. Whitfield reviewed the flagged documents with a growing sense of unease. Something about the timing felt too convenient, too neatly constructed, but the paperwork on its surface appeared legitimate. University policy required a formal review whenever financial irregularities were flagged, regardless of any administrator's personal instincts. She called Josie in for a preliminary meeting that same afternoon. Josie sat across the wide conference table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to project a calm she didn't fully feel. "I want to be clear," Whitfield said, her tone measured, not unkind, "that this meeting is a preliminary review. Nothing has been decided. But I need to walk you through what's been flagged, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She slid a folder across the table. Josie opened it with trembling hands. She stared at financial statements she had never seen before, numbers and dates that meant nothing to her, yet somehow connected on paper to her scholarship account. "I've never seen any of this," Josie said, genuinely bewildered. "I don't even know how to access these records. I've never touched the fund directly." Whitfield studied her carefully. The way a person studies someone, they're trying hard to believe. "I want to believe you, Miss Calder," she said finally. "Your record here has been exemplary. But I have an obligation to investigate this fully given the seriousness of the allegations. I'm afraid that means a formal disciplinary hearing will need to be scheduled." "When?" Josie asked, her voice barely steady. Whitfield checked her calendar. Her expression tightened with something close to regret. "Given the board's schedule," she said, "and pressure from certain donors, I'm afraid it needs to happen soon. This coming Friday afternoon." Josie's stomach dropped. Friday afternoon was 5 days away. Friday afternoon was also, she remembered with a fresh wave of dread, the same day as Ashford's annual Family Weekend Gala, the university's largest donor event of the year. "That's the day of the gala," Josie said quietly. "I'm aware," Whitfield said, her voice apologetic but firm. "It wasn't my preference for timing, believe me, but certain scheduling pressures made it hard to move." Josie left that meeting in a daze. She walked across campus without fully registering where her feet were carrying her. The weight of an impossible 5 days pressed down on her chest. She had no way of knowing that the very same afternoon, 2 men in a small history office had just received a response to their carefully worded message. A response that would set an entirely different, far more powerful set of events into motion. Constance Whitfield did not sleep particularly well that Monday night. She had chaired the scholarship committee for 11 years, and in that time, she had developed a fairly reliable instinct for the difference between honest mistakes and manufactured ones. Something about Josie Calder's file bothered her long after the girl had left her office, though she couldn't immediately articulate what. She returned to campus early Tuesday morning before most of the administrative staff had arrived and pulled the flagged documents again, spreading them across her desk in the quiet, empty light of dawn. The discrepancies were technically plausible. That was what troubled her most. They were too clean, too precisely aligned with Josie's own enrollment dates, without a single stray inconsistency of the kind that usually appeared in genuine clerical errors. Real mistakes in Whitfield's long experience were messy. They wandered. They involved multiple small errors, compounding over time. Not one tidy, self-contained narrative arriving all at once, fully formed. This looked to her increasingly suspicious eye like something built rather than something that had simply happened. She placed a call to the university's information technology office, requesting access logs for the scholarship database covering the previous month. It was a small procedural request, well within her authority as committee chair. The answer came back late that afternoon, and it was not what she expected. The database had been accessed twice outside normal business hours from an external network address that didn't belong to any registered university account. Whitfield stared at the report for a long moment. She had suspected, she now realized that something wasn't right about this case from nearly the beginning. She couldn't yet prove who was responsible. She couldn't yet prove intent. But she understood, sitting alone in her office that evening, that she was no longer simply reviewing a scholarship discrepancy. She was looking at the early evidence of something that had been deliberately constructed to hurt one specific student. She made a note in her private file to raise the access log discrepancy directly during Friday's hearing, regardless of what pressure certain donors might apply beforehand. Whatever was happening here, she intended to make absolutely certain the truth had a chance to surface before any final decision was made. The reply Higgins and Lindholm had been waiting for arrived in Professor Lindholm's inbox that same Thursday just after 4 in the afternoon. Brief, formal, unmistakably urgent in its careful diplomatic language. He read it twice before calling Higgins immediately. They responded. Lindholm said, his voice tight with barely contained energy. The consulate. They're taking this seriously, very seriously. What did they say? Higgins asked. They're requesting verification, Lindholm said. Photographs, any documentation we can provide. And they mentioned very carefully that certain members of the royal household would need to be informed immediately if the details could be substantiated. Higgins was quiet for a moment. How quickly can we get them what they need? He asked finally. I can send photographs of the pendant tonight, Lindholm said. I photographed it discreetly weeks ago when I first noticed the resemblance to the Aldheim royal seal. It should be more than enough to open the right doors. Then do it tonight, Higgins said. His voice carried a resolve that had clearly been building for weeks. That girl has a hearing tomorrow that could end her education here. Built entirely on lies, manufactured by people who've never once had to earn anything honestly in their lives. If there's any chance the truth can reach the right people before then, we owe it to Eleanor and to her daughter to try. Lindholm nodded, though Higgins couldn't see him. He turned back to his computer, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Outside, the sky over Ashford had darkened into evening. Campus lights flickered on one by one across the quad. Neither Josie Calder nor Bradley Whitmore yet understood that tomorrow was about to become the most consequential day of both their lives. 3,000 miles away on a windswept coastline. Few Ashford students could have located on a map the photographs Lindholm sent that night reached a small secure office inside the royal residence of Aldheim just before dawn. The palace itself sat low against gray stone cliffs, older than most nations built to withstand centuries of northern storms. Inside its private study, a man in his late 50s sat behind a heavy oak desk, reading glasses balanced low on his nose, working through the quiet, unglamorous paperwork that most people never imagined came attached to a crown. His private secretary entered without knocking, an old privilege reserved for only the most urgent matters. Your Majesty, he said, I apologize for the hour. Something has arrived from the consulate abroad. I believe you'll want to see it immediately. King Aldrich of Aldheim looked up, faintly annoyed at the interruption, an expression that faded the moment he saw his secretary's face. What is it? He asked, setting down his pen. The secretary placed a folder on the desk, without a word, opening it to the first photograph inside. The king went very still. It was an image of a young woman's neck, a simple silver pendant resting against her collarbone. The photograph was slightly grainy, taken from a discreet angle in what looked like a university lecture hall, but the pattern engraved into that pendant was unmistakable. He had commissioned it himself decades ago from the royal jeweler in the capital, one of only 2 ever made. He had given the other one to a woman he had never stopped thinking about, not once in 18 long years. Where, the king said quietly, his voice suddenly unsteady in a way his secretary had rarely heard, did this photograph come from? "A university in the United States, sir," the secretary said carefully. "A professor there, along with a former member of our own humanitarian coordination unit from years ago, reached out to the consulate. They believe the young woman in this photograph may be your daughter." The king closed his eyes for a long moment. 18 years of careful distance. 18 years of respecting a choice that had never once stopped hurting him. 18 years of wondering quietly in rooms just like this one, whether he had made the right decision by letting Eleanor Calder walk away, untouched by a crown that would have consumed her. "Her name," the king said, finally opening his eyes. "Do we have her name?" The secretary checked his notes. "Josephine Calder, sir. Goes by Josie. A freshman at Ashford University. 18 years old." 18 years old. The math arrived in the king's chest before his mind had even finished the calculation, landing with the full, undeniable weight of certainty. "There's something else, sir," the secretary added carefully. The message mentioned some trouble, a financial dispute at the university, apparently quite serious. "A disciplinary hearing has already been scheduled, tomorrow afternoon." The king rose slowly from his desk, walking to the tall window overlooking the gray northern sea. The same water he had once stood beside as a much younger man. Before duty had asked something of him he had never fully forgiven it for. "Prepare the plane," he said quietly without turning around. "And find out everything, absolutely everything about this hearing and about the boy who seems determined to hurt my daughter before I've even had the chance to meet her." "Yes, Your Majesty," the secretary said, already moving toward the door. The king remained at the window a while longer, watching the waves break against the cliffs below. 18 years of careful, patient silence, finally, at long last, beginning to end. By Wednesday, word of the scholarship investigation had begun to leak. The way sensitive news always seems to on a small campus, no matter how carefully it's supposed to be contained. Josie first noticed the shift in the dining hall. A few students who had once smiled at her in passing now looked away quickly, unsure how to react to rumors they didn't fully understand. Maddie, loyal as ever, sat with her. Anyway, ignoring the whispers with a stubbornness Josie deeply appreciated. "People are idiots," Maddie said, flatly stabbing at her food. "Nobody actually knows anything. They just like having something to talk about." "It still feels awful," Josie admitted. "I know," Maddie said, her voice softening. "For what it's worth, I don't believe a word of it. Not for 1 second." Ruth echoed the same sentiment that night, sitting cross-legged on her bed, while Josie stared blankly at her textbook, unable to focus on a single page. "Whatever happens Friday," Ruth said quietly, "the people who actually know you aren't going anywhere. Remember that." Josie tried to hold on to those words. Some nights they were enough to help her sleep. Other nights the fear crept back in. Regardless, whispering that everything she had worked for might disappear because of lies she hadn't even seen yet. 300 miles north, in the small kitchen in Ashfield Hollow, Eleanor Calder spent that Thursday evening unable to settle into anything at all. She had tried reading. She had tried the small stack of mending that usually calmed her hands when her mind wouldn't quiet down. Nothing worked. She kept returning again and again to the same worn wooden box at the top of her closet, the one holding the unsent letter she had written so many years ago. She took it down that night and read it once more by lamplight, the paper soft and familiar beneath her fingers. "My dearest, if you are reading this, it means I finally found the courage." She had never sent it. She had told herself for 18 years that the timing was never quite right, that Josie needed to grow into her own strength before any of this complicated truth arrived to complicate it further. But sitting there that night, knowing her daughter faced a hearing built on lies, the following afternoon, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, quiet but unmistakable, the way a long-held dam finally begins to give way. She thought of Higgins, whom she hadn't spoken to directly in 18 years, and found herself wondering for the first time whether it was truly only coincidence that her daughter's path had crossed his, of all the people in the world, at exactly this university. She thought of the man in the photographs at the top of that same box, young and laughing, standing beside her on a coastline half a world away. She did not yet know that Higgins and a history professor had already reached the consulate. She did not yet know that a plane was being prepared on a private runway overlooking gray northern water. But some part of her, some old quiet instinct she had carried since the day she'd first felt Josie move inside her, told her that tomorrow was going to be different. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside the box, and for the first time in 18 years did not close the lid all the way. "Be strong tomorrow," she whispered into the quiet of her small kitchen, as if the words could somehow travel the 300 miles between herself and her daughter. "Just one more day. I think somehow help is finally on its way." Bradley, for his part, watched the unfolding chaos with a strange, uneasy satisfaction he didn't fully examine. He told himself this was simply justice, catching up with someone who had embarrassed him one too many times. He told himself Josie Calder had brought this on herself somehow, though he couldn't quite explain how, if pressed. He didn't yet know his father had fabricated the entire situation from nothing. He found out on Thursday evening during a phone call he hadn't expected. "It's done," Elliot said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man closing a successful business deal. "The hearing's set for tomorrow, right before the gala. Perfect timing, if I do say so myself." "Wait," Bradley said slowly, something uneasy stirring in his chest. "What exactly did you do?" "I made sure the right documents ended up in the right hands," Elliot said simply. "Nothing that traces back to us. Nothing that ever will." "You mean you made it up?" Bradley said. It wasn't quite a question. "I mean, I told a convincing enough story," Elliot said, his tone sharpening slightly. "Don't go soft on me now, Bradley. You wanted this girl handled. Consider her handled." Bradley sat in silence for a long moment after the call ended, staring at his phone. He thought of Josie standing in the quad, shielding her mother, refusing to back down, even as he'd tried again and again to make her feel small. He thought of the calm, steady way she'd handled Grant Colby's injury in the gymnasium. I thought uncomfortably of the quiet dignity she'd carried through every single humiliation he'd thrown at her. Something in his chest twisted small and unfamiliar. He pushed the feeling away quickly, the way he always did, telling himself it didn't matter. Telling himself she deserved whatever came next. He almost believed it. He tried to distract himself that evening the way he usually did, gathering his usual group of friends in the common room, turning on a game none of them really watched. But the conversation kept circling back uninvited to the scholarship hearing. "You really think she did it?" one of his friends, a lanky sophomore named Cole, asked during a lull in the noise. "Skimming scholarship money doesn't really seem like her type, if I'm being honest." "What do you know about her type?" Bradley snapped sharper than he meant to. Cole raised both hands in mock surrender. "Just saying, man. She seemed pretty solid when Grant went down at orientation. Didn't hesitate for a second. People who steal from veterans' funds don't usually act like that." Bradley didn't answer. He stared at the television without seeing it, Cole's offhand comment settling somewhere uncomfortable beneath his ribs, refusing to leave. He told himself once again that it wasn't his problem. His father had handled the details. He hadn't asked for specifics. He hadn't wanted to know exactly how the documents had come together, because some part of him buried deep beneath years of easy privilege already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. He went to bed that night telling himself for the third or fourth time that evening that everything happening was simply justice, finally catching up to a girl who had embarrassed him one too many times. Sleep, when it finally came, was thinner than usual. Friday morning arrived at Ashford wrapped in a thin silver fog, the kind that made the old stone buildings look almost like something out of a storybook. Josie woke early, unable to sleep past 5. Her stomach twisted into knots she couldn't untangle no matter how many slow breaths she took. Today, in a matter of hours, a committee of strangers would decide whether everything she had built here would be allowed to continue. She dressed carefully, choosing the same plain gray blazer she'd worn to her scholarship interview the previous spring. A small private ritual meant to remind herself of who she truly was, regardless of what anyone in that hearing room believed. Ruth hugged her tightly before she left. "You've got this," she said. "Whatever happens, you've got this." Josie wasn't sure she believed her, but she nodded anyway and stepped out into the fog. She hadn't made it halfway across the quad before a familiar figure fell into step beside her. Unhurried, steady, his gray crew cut, catching the pale morning light. "Mr. Higgins," Josie said, startled. "You're up early?" "Same time I'm always up," Higgins said simply. "Thought you might want some company on the walk over." Josie glanced at him sideways, grateful though she couldn't quite explain why his presence steadied her the way it did. "Are you allowed to just walk with students like this?" she asked, a small, tired smile tugging at her mouth, despite everything. "Nobody's ever stopped me yet," Higgins said. "And I'd like to see them try today of all days." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their footsteps echoing softly against the wet brick path. "Can I tell you something?" Higgins said finally. "That might sound strange coming from an old groundskeeper you barely know." "I think today's earned a little strange," Josie said. Higgins allowed himself a small, brief smile. "Whatever happens in that room today, Miss Calder, I want you to remember something. The people who try hardest to tear someone down are almost always the ones most afraid of being seen clearly themselves. You have nothing to fear from being seen clearly. Nothing at all." Josie looked at him, something in his tone carrying more weight than the words alone explained. "You sound like you know something I don't," she said slowly. Higgins held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable, careful. "I know that your mother is one of the finest people I've ever had the privilege of meeting," he said finally. "And I know her daughter is cut from exactly the same cloth. That's all I'll say for now. But hold on to it if today gets difficult." He stopped at the edge of the administration building, gesturing toward the door with a small nod. "Go on," he said. "Chin up. Whatever they think they know in there, they don't know the whole story yet. Not even close." Josie nodded, unsure exactly what he meant, but comforted regardless. She climbed the steps toward the hearing room, Higgins's quiet words settling somewhere deep in her chest, a small steady anchor against the fear still churning beneath the surface. She had no idea that across the city, in a quiet office at the Aldheim consulate, a secure phone line had connected hours earlier to a palace overlooking gray northern water. She had no idea that a king had already read her name and was at that very moment somewhere over the Atlantic, watching dark water pass beneath the wing of a plane he had ordered prepared before the sun had even fully risen. And she had no idea that by the time the sun set on this long, impossible day, absolutely nothing about her life at Ashford University would ever be the same again. Every story like this one has a moment where things look darkest right before they change forever. This is that moment. Friday afternoon arrived at Ashford, wrapped in the same thin fog that had followed the whole week, gray and heavy, clinging to the old stone buildings like it didn't want to let go. Josie sat outside the hearing room on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the second hand on the wall clock move slower than she had ever known time to move. She had no idea, sitting there, just how much was about to change before this single day was finished. The hearing room was small, wood-paneled, the kind of formal space designed to make ordinary people feel like the weight of the institution was pressing down on them from every direction. Constance Whitfield sat at the head of a long table flanked by two other committee members, a stack of documents arranged neatly in front of her. Josie sat alone on the opposite side. Her attorney, a young legal aid volunteer from the university's student assistance office, seated beside her, with a thin folder that felt to Josie hopelessly outmatched by whatever evidence sat across the table. "We'll begin," Whitfield said, her voice formal, measured. "This hearing concerns allegations of financial misconduct related to the Hartwell Family Veterans Legacy Scholarship, specifically involving funds associated with student Josephine Calder." She walked through the documents methodically. The falsified statements, the manufactured pattern of discrepancies, each page landing on the table with a small, heavy sound that felt to Josie like a slow accumulation of guilt she had never actually earned. "Miss Calder," Whitfield said finally, "do you have any explanation for these discrepancies?" "I've never seen these documents before today," Josie said, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "I don't have access to the scholarship fund's financial system. I've never touched it, not once since when I arrived here." One of the other committee members, an older man named Dean Aldous Pierce, leaned forward with visible skepticism. "That's a difficult claim to verify, Miss Calder," he said. especially given the precision of these records. They align almost perfectly with your enrollment dates. That's exactly what concerns me, Whitfield interjected, glancing pointedly at her own private notes. The precision itself. Pierce waved a dismissive hand. Precision isn't innocence constants. If anything, it suggests careful planning. Josie felt her stomach drop further. Whitfield opened her mouth to raise the access log discrepancy she had discovered earlier that week. But before she could speak, the door at the back of the room opened. Elliot Whitmore stepped inside, dressed in an impeccable gray suit, radiating the calm, practiced confidence of a man who had walked into 100 rooms, exactly like this one, and always left, having gotten precisely what he wanted. "Forgive the interruption," Elliot said smoothly. "As a significant donor to this institution, and given the seriousness of what's being alleged here regarding funds meant for our veteran community, I felt it appropriate to observe these proceedings personally." Whitfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is a closed hearing, Mr. Whitmore." "Of course," Elliot said, settling into a chair near the back, regardless his tone leaving no real room for argument. "I'll simply observe, silently. I do have a considerable stake in ensuring the integrity of this university's scholarship programs, you understand." The message beneath his words was clear enough to everyone in the room. Josie felt the weight of it settle over the proceedings, like a fresh layer of fog. The hearing continued for another 20 minutes, Whitfield attempting carefully to introduce her concerns about the database access logs, only to be repeatedly redirected by Pierce toward the documents themselves, toward Josie's inability to produce an alternative explanation for numbers she had never seen before that week. By the time Whitfield called for a brief recess to allow the committee to deliberate, Josie already understood with a sinking hollow certainty exactly which direction this was heading. The committee returned 25 minutes later. Whitfield's expression, usually so composed, carried a visible strain Josie hadn't seen in their earlier meeting. "Given the evidence presented," Whitfield said slowly, clearly choosing each word with reluctance, "and pending a more thorough investigation, the committee has voted to temporarily suspend Miss Calder's scholarship status and her enrollment privileges, effective immediately." The words landed like a physical blow. Josie felt the room tilt slightly around her. "This is not a final determination," Whitfield added quickly, meeting Josie's eyes directly, an unmistakable apology buried somewhere in her expression. "A full investigation will continue. But given the seriousness of the allegations and certain pressures regarding the integrity of our veteran scholarship programs, the committee felt an immediate suspension was necessary." Elliot Whitmore, seated near the back, allowed himself the smallest, most private smile. Josie walked out of that hearing room in a daze, her legal aid attorney murmuring something about appeals processes and timelines that barely registered through the ringing in her ears. She had lost. Not permanently, perhaps, but completely for now, in front of exactly the people whose judgment mattered most to her future. She sat down hard on the same wooden bench where she'd waited that morning, unable to make her legs carry her any further, and finally allowed herself to cry quietly, her face buried in her hands. This was the moment the whole story seemed for just a little while to be over. The moment every ounce of quiet dignity Josie Calder had carried through 3 difficult weeks finally met a wall too large to climb. She had no idea that less than 2 miles away, a very different kind of vehicle was already approaching Ashford's front gates. The family weekend gala began at 7 that evening in Ashford's Grand Hall, an enormous stone building normally reserved for graduation ceremonies and the university's most important formal occasions. Chandeliers threw warm gold light across marble floors. String music drifted from a small ensemble near the far wall. Donors, alumni, faculty, and trustees mingled in evening wear, champagne glasses in hand, the entire evening humming with exactly the kind of polished, self-satisfied energy such events were designed to produce. Josie almost didn't come. She sat in her dorm room for nearly an hour after the hearing, staring at the plain black dress Ruth had insisted she pack, wondering what possible reason she had to attend an event celebrating an institution that had just that very afternoon decided she might be a thief. "You should go," Ruth said gently, sitting beside her on the bed. "Not for them, for you. Don't let him win twice in one day." Maddie arriving a few minutes later with an armful of borrowed jewelry. Nobody asked for, agreed just as firmly. Walk in there with your head up, Maddie said. Let them see exactly who they tried to knock down today. Let them see. She's still standing. Something in their words reached her slowly through the exhaustion and grief still tangled in her chest. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone earlier that week. Don't let anyone shake your certainty about who you are. She thought of Dr. Patterson's words in the counseling office. That part, nobody can take from you. She thought finally of Higgins that morning, his quiet certainty carrying more weight than she'd fully understood at the time. Whatever they think they know in there, they don't know the whole story yet. She dressed slowly, deliberately, and walked into the gala that evening, with her chin lifted, her mother's old pendant resting as always against her collarbone. She had no idea walking through those grand doors that Constance Whitfield had spent the last several hours in her office, working furiously alongside the university's IT department, finally tracing the falsified database access directly back to an external contractor with documented ties to Whitmore Development Group. She had no idea that a video quietly surfacing that same evening from a freshman's old orientation day footage had already reached Professor Lindholm's inbox, showing with unmistakable clarity the exact silver crest Bradley Whitmore had once mocked as cheap costume jewelry. And she had absolutely no idea that somewhere above the Atlantic, a private aircraft carrying the King of Aldheim had already begun its final descent toward the small regional airport nearest Ashford University. The video itself had arrived almost by accident. A quiet sophomore named Priya Nair, who had recorded most of move-in day for her own personal video journal, and never once considered posting any of it publicly, happened to mention the footage to a friend that same week, describing almost in passing an uncomfortable scene she'd caught near the check-in tables. The friend who had heard the growing rumors swirling around Josie's name asked to see it. Within an hour, the clip had made its way to Maddie, who recognized immediately what she was looking at, and sent it straight to Professor Lindholm with a short, urgent message explaining exactly why it mattered. Lindholm watched it twice, his hands trembling slightly by the second viewing, before forwarding it directly to Constance Whitfield, along with a brief note of his own. None of it had been planned. None of it had been orchestrated by anyone hoping for a dramatic reveal. It was simply the truth, sitting quietly on an ordinary student's phone for 3 weeks, waiting for someone to finally look at it and understand exactly what they were seeing. Bradley spotted her almost immediately. He had spent the afternoon in quiet, uneasy triumph, telling himself repeatedly that justice had simply been served, that Josie Calder had gotten exactly what people like her eventually got when they overstepped their place. But watching her walk into the gala that evening, composed, dignified, refusing to hide, despite everything the day had thrown at her, that same uncomfortable twist returned to his chest. Sharper this time, he pushed it down the way he always did, gathering his usual confidence around himself like armor, and crossed the room toward her with 2 of his friends trailing behind. Bold move, Bradley said, stepping into her path, his voice pitched just loud enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. Showing up here after this afternoon. I have to admit, I didn't expect that. I earned my place at this university, Josie said, evenly refusing to break stride. I'm not going to let you decide otherwise. Funny, Bradley said, considering the scholarship committee seems to disagree with you. He glanced around theatrically at the gathered crowd, several of whom had begun quietly watching the exchange. Suspended? On a technicality, sure, but suspended all the same. Maybe next time you'll think twice before pretending to be something you're not. A small, cold silence settled around them. Josie felt heat rise in her face, humiliation and anger tangled together. But she held her ground, refusing to give him the reaction he was so clearly hunting for. You don't know anything about who I am, she said quietly. You never have. I know you came here alone. Bradley pressed something almost desperate now, entering his voice, as though he needed this final victory more than he understood himself. No father, no name anyone's ever heard of. Just you pretending you belong somewhere you clearly don't. The words hung in the air, cruel and final. Exactly the kind of humiliation he had been building toward since the very first afternoon they'd met. And that was the precise moment the enormous front doors of Ashford's Grand Hall swung open behind him. A sudden hush moved through the room, like a wave starting near the entrance and rippling outward across the crowd. Bradley turned along with nearly everyone else to see what had caused it. Outside, visible through the tall glass doors, a small motorcade had pulled into the university's main courtyard. Two dark sedans flanked a long, gleaming black limousine. Its windows, tinted its frame unmistakably, reinforced the kind of vehicle ordinary people only ever saw in news footage of world leaders. University security guards, caught completely off guard, hurried to clear space near the entrance, murmuring urgently into radios. A small cluster of serious-looking men in dark suits emerged first from the sedans, forming a discreet, practiced perimeter. Then the door of the limousine opened. A man stepped out, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a formal dark suit that carried itself with unmistakable authority, despite its simplicity. He moved with the quiet, deliberate composure of someone entirely unaccustomed to hurrying someone whose presence alone seemed to reorganize the air around him. He paused for one brief moment at the base of the steps, looking up at the grand stone building in front of him, before walking forward, his security detail falling into step a respectful distance behind. Inside the hall, the string music faltered, then stopped entirely. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye in the room turned toward the entrance. Professor Lindholm, standing near the edge of the crowd with Higgins beside him, felt his breath catch in his throat. "That's him?" Lindholm whispered. "That's really him." Higgins said nothing at all, though his eyes had gone bright and unmistakably wet, watching the doors with an intensity that startled even Lindholm standing beside him. The man walked through Ashford's grand entrance, past stunned faculty and silent trustees, his gaze moving steadily across the crowd until it landed finally, unmistakably, on a young woman standing near the center of the room in a plain black dress, a small silver pendant resting against her collarbone. He stopped walking. For one long suspended moment, nobody in that enormous hall moved or spoke at all. Then the man began walking again, more quickly now, directly toward her, his composure cracking slightly with something that looked unmistakably like 18 years of carefully restrained emotion, finally breaking free. Josie stood utterly bewildered, watching this stranger cross the entire length of the room toward her. Bradley, standing just beside her, had gone completely pale, his earlier confidence evaporating entirely as the man's security detail spread quietly around the edges of the gathering. The man stopped a few feet in front of Josie, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between disbelief and overwhelming relief. "Josephine," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent Josie couldn't immediately place, gentle, careful, as though testing the shape of her name for the first time. "That is your name, isn't it?" Josephine called her. "Yes." Josie managed her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you?" The man's eyes glistened, and for a moment he simply looked at her, drinking in every detail of her face, as though committing it finally permanently to memory. Then, in front of the entire stunned gathering, he lowered himself slowly onto one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers instead of towering above her. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. "My name is Aldrich," he said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he seemed to be fighting hard to control. "I am the King of Aldheim, and I am your father." Josie felt the entire room sideways around her, the noise of 200 stunned guests fading into something distant and muffled as though she were suddenly underwater. That's not possible," she whispered. "It is," the king said gently. I have waited 18 years for the chance to say those words to you. 18 years longer than I ever wanted to wait." He reached out carefully and touched the small silver pendant resting against her collarbone, the same pendant Bradley had once mocked as cheap and worthless. "I gave your mother this," he said softly, "the day before we were separated. There is only one other like it in the entire world. It has been mine since the day I was born." He reached inside his jacket and withdrew a second pendant, identical in every detail, resting against his own chest beneath his shirt collar. The crowd around them had gone almost entirely silent now, save for a few sharp, disbelieving whispers rippling outward through the hall. Bradley stood frozen a few feet away, staring at the scene in front of him with an expression of pure, unraveling horror. "I don't understand," Josie said, tears beginning to blur her vision. My mother never told me any of this. She said my father wasn't in the picture. She was protecting you, the king said gently, rising slowly back to his feet. Though he kept his voice low, private meant only for her despite the crowd surrounding them. And protecting my kingdom at a time when the two of us being together would have caused enormous upheaval for people who had no say in the matter. Your mother made an extraordinarily difficult choice out of love, not abandonment. I need you to understand that clearly from this very first moment. You knew about me, Josie said slowly, piecing it together. This whole time. I did not know for certain until 3 days ago, the king said. I had my suspicions once many years past, but your mother made her decisions so completely, so thoroughly, that I never found the evidence to confirm them. 2 men on this campus changed that. I owe them a debt I don't believe I can ever fully repay. He glanced past her toward the edge of the crowd, where Higgins and Professor Lindholm stood, watching both visibly overwhelmed. The king's eyes fixed on Higgins, and something like profound recognition passed across his face. Sergeant Higgins, he said, his voice suddenly rough with emotion. It has been a very long time. Higgins stepped forward slowly, his usual composure cracking at last, and offered a small, formal bow that carried decades of history within it. Your Majesty, Higgins said. I made a promise to Eleanor a long time ago that I would watch over her daughter if our paths ever crossed again. I only wish I could have brought this to you sooner. You brought it exactly when it mattered most, the king said. That is enough. That is more than enough. Across the room, Elliot Whitmore had gone visibly dramatically pale, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. I understood with sickening clarity exactly what he was witnessing. For the past 6 months, Whitmore Development Group had been negotiating one of the largest investment deals in the company's history. A partnership with a sovereign wealth fund representing the Kingdom of Aldheim, aimed at developing a series of sustainable coastal properties along the eastern seaboard. The deal, if finalized, would have been the crowning achievement of Elliot's entire career. He had spent months courting that partnership, flying twice to meetings he'd assumed were with mid-level financial representatives, never once realizing the full weight of the crown standing quietly behind those negotiations. And his own son had spent the last several weeks tormenting, humiliating, and attempting to destroy the reputation of that same king's only daughter. Elliot set down his glass, with a hand that had gone visibly unsteady. Beside him, a member of his negotiating team who had arrived earlier that evening as a courtesy guest leaned in, with a whisper that landed like a physical blow. Elliot, the man murmured, his own face pale with alarm. I think we may have a very serious problem. The king turned finally, his gaze settling deliberately on Bradley, who stood frozen a few feet away, all his earlier bravado utterly evaporated. You, the king said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority, are the young man who mocked my daughter for arriving here without a father present. Bradley opened his mouth and closed it again, finding for the first time in his entire privileged life absolutely nothing to say. You called her pendant fake. The king continued, his voice, quiet, controlled, somehow more devastating for its restraint than any shout could have been. You mocked her for not knowing her own family's worth. And this afternoon, I understand you and your father conspired to falsify documents accusing her of stealing from a fund meant to honor the very people who sacrifice everything for the freedoms your family has enjoyed without ever once earning them yourselves. The entire hall had gone utterly silent, every guest straining to hear each word. I do not know, the king said slowly, whether your father built his fortune through honest means or otherwise. That is not tonight my concern. But I know precisely what kind of man raises a son willing to humiliate an innocent young woman for the simple crime of arriving somewhere without wealth trailing behind her. He paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering his final words with quiet, devastating finality. My daughter did not need my crown to have worth, he said. She had it long before I ever knew her name. You young man appear to have needed every advantage your family could purchase, and still managed to demonstrate none at all. Bradley said nothing. He simply stood there, utterly exposed in front of the entire assembled weight of Ashford's donor community, faculty, and student body. Constance Whitfield pushed her way through the stunned crowd at that moment, arriving slightly breathless, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the enormity of the moment. "Forgive the interruption. I believe I have information directly relevant to what's occurring here." The king turned toward her, his expression softening slightly, recognizing an ally when he saw one. "I chair the scholarship committee," Whitfield continued. "This afternoon, we suspended Miss Calder's enrollment based on falsified financial records. I have just confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that those records were manufactured through unauthorized access, originating from a contractor with direct documented ties to Whitmore Development Group." A fresh wave of gasps moved through the crowd. Elliot Whitmore, standing frozen near the edge of the room, looked as though the marble floor beneath him had genuinely begun to give way. "There's more," Lindholm added, stepping forward, holding up his phone. "A video recorded entirely by coincidence on move-in day by another student. It shows Bradley Whitmore forcibly removing Miss Calder's pendant and mocking it publicly, 3 weeks before any scholarship irregularities were ever flagged. The timeline, combined with the falsified access logs, makes the sequence of events extremely clear." Whitfield turned to the king, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I intend to reverse Miss Calder's suspension immediately, Your Majesty, effective this instant. And I intend to recommend a full investigation into Mr. Whitmore's conduct, both the son and, given tonight's revelations, potentially the father as well." The king nodded, once his expression grave but grateful. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing what others chose not to." Elliot Whitmore, understanding with total clarity that his most important business deal in decades had just collapsed catastrophically in front of 200 witnesses, attempted one final desperate recovery. "Your Majesty," he said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced tone of a man accustomed to talking his way out of difficult rooms, "I assure you, whatever misunderstanding has occurred here tonight, my company remains fully committed to our partnership discussions. My son's behavior, while regrettable, has absolutely no bearing on." "It has every bearing," the king said, cutting him off with quiet, immovable finality. "A man's character is measured most clearly in how he treats those who cannot immediately benefit him. Your son treated my daughter as an object of ridicule for 3 consecutive weeks, believing her powerless and unprotected. You, it seems, financed that cruelty directly. I do not build partnerships with men who behave this way, Mr. Whitmore, regardless of what your balance sheets might otherwise suggest." Elliot opened his mouth once more, then closed it, finally understanding that no amount of practiced charm would undo what tonight had revealed. He turned without another word and walked quickly toward the exit, Bradley trailing several humiliated steps behind him, the entire hall watching their departure in heavy, uninterrupted silence. Once the Whitmores had gone, something shifted in the room, the tension breaking slowly into something softer, gentler. The king turned back to Josie, his expression easing into something warmer, more tender. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. "An entire lifetime of one, if you're willing to hear it." "I think," Josie said, wiping at her eyes, a small disbelieving laugh escaping despite everything, "I'm going to need considerably more than one conversation to understand all of this." "Then we shall have as many conversations as you need," the king said. "For as long as it takes, I promise you that." He glanced around the hall at the crowd of stunned faculty and students still watching, then gently guided Josie toward a quieter corner of the room where he began carefully to tell her everything. He told her about a humanitarian mission many years ago, about a young nurse who refused to be impressed by his title, about long nights working alongside her in difficult conditions, falling in love slowly and completely with a woman who had never once cared what crown he might someday wear. He told her about the rigid succession laws of that era, laws that would have stripped him of his place in line to the throne entirely had he married outside a narrow, approved circle. He told her how the palace council had discovered their relationship and separated them before either of them fully understood what was happening. "I did not know about you," he said softly, "until your mother's message reached me 3 days ago. If I had known, Josephine, I promise you nothing on this earth would have kept me away." "She never told me," Josie said quietly. "Not once in 18 years. She was protecting you, the king said again gently, from a life of scrutiny, expectation, and constant public attention that comes with a crown, whether you want it or not. She wanted you to grow up simply as yourself without a title, shaping every choice you made. I understand her reasoning even now. It does not make the years apart hurt any less. What would have happened, Josie asked slowly, if she had told your family the truth back then? The king considered the question for a long moment before answering. At that time, he said, I believe our council would have forced an impossible choice. Either she would have been asked to disappear quietly in exchange for support they'd have framed as generous, or I would have been asked to step aside from the succession entirely, leaving the kingdom's future in far less certain hands. Your mother understood both outcomes clearly better than I did at the time, if I am honest. She chose a third option nobody else had considered. She simply raised you herself entirely on her own terms, and let the rest of us catch up whenever we were finally ready. That sounds incredibly lonely, Josie said quietly. It was, the king said. For both of us, in very different ways. I have spent 18 years attending to a kingdom that never once asked how much I missed the family I never got to know. Your mother spent those same 18 years working double shifts alone in a small town most of my own advisors couldn't find on a map, giving you a life of remarkable strength and character, despite every difficulty in her path. He paused, studying Josie's face carefully. I do not say any of this to excuse the years we lost, he added, only to help you understand that every choice made, however painful, was made from love, not indifference. Never indifference. Josie thought of her mother 300 miles north and felt a fresh wave of emotion rise in her chest, gratitude and grief and something entirely new, all tangled together at once. I need to call her, Josie said, right now. Asim Tamim. The king smiled, the first genuinely easy smile Josie had seen cross his face all evening. I would like very much to speak with her myself, he said, if she's willing. Josie stepped just outside the grand hall's tall glass doors into the cool evening air and dialed her mother's number with shaking hands. Eleanor picked up on the first ring. Josie, she said immediately, her voice tight with worry. I heard about the hearing. I've been sick all day. Are you all right? What happened? Mom, Josie said, her voice breaking slightly, tears finally spilling over freely. There's someone here. He says he's my father. There was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. Is his name Aldrich? Eleanor finally whispered, her own voice suddenly thick with emotion. Yes, Josie said. Mom, what is happening? Please, just tell me everything. Eleanor was quiet for another long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried 18 years of carefully guarded love, finally completely breaking free. I'm coming, Eleanor said. Right now, tonight. I'll explain everything, every single piece of it, the moment I get there. I promise you, sweetheart. I promise. Josie stood in the cool night air a while longer after the call ended, looking back through the glass doors at the extraordinary scene unfolding inside at Higgins and Lindholm, standing together near the edge of the crowd at Whitfield, speaking quietly with the king's security detail. At an entire life she thought she understood completely rearranging itself around her in real time. For the first time in 3 exhausting weeks, she allowed herself fully to breathe. Eleanor arrived just before midnight, having borrowed a neighbor's car and driven the entire 300 miles without stopping once. She walked into Ashford's now nearly empty Grand Hall, still dressed in her simple work clothes, her hair windblown from the drive, and stopped completely still. The moment she saw him standing there, waiting for her, exactly as she remembered. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. You came? Eleanor finally whispered. I should have come 18 years ago, Aldrich said quietly. I am so deeply sorry it took this long. I made that choice, Eleanor said. Not you. We made it together, he said gently. Even if only one of us understood at the time exactly what it would cost. Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew a small worn envelope, its edges soft from years of handling. I wrote this a long time ago, she said, pressing it carefully into his hands. I never had the courage to send it. I think after tonight it finally belongs with you instead of hidden away in a box in my closet. Aldrich held the letter for a long moment without opening it, his thumb tracing the faded ink of his own name on the front. 18 years late, he said softly, is still not too late. No, Eleanor agreed, a small, tired smile finally breaking through. I don't suppose it is. Josie watched her parents finally fully see each other again after 18 years apart, and felt something in her own chest settle quietly into place. A piece of herself she hadn't fully realized was missing until this very moment. In the days that followed, Ashford University moved quickly. Bradley Whitmore was formally expelled within the week, following a full investigation that confirmed beyond any doubt his and his father's role in fabricating evidence against Josie. Elliot Whitmore's name was quietly permanently removed from the university's donor recognition wall, and Whitmore Development Group's investment partnership with Aldheim's Sovereign Fund collapsed entirely, along with several other business relationships that unraveled once word of the scandal spread. Constance Whitfield issued a formal public apology to Josie before the full student body, acknowledging the pressure that had led to an unjust, hasty decision, and pledged publicly to reform the scholarship committee's review process to prevent similar manipulation in the future. Students who had stayed silent during the weeks of rumor and humiliation began slowly to speak up, offering testimonies about what they'd witnessed. Small acts of quiet courage, arriving weeks too late to have prevented the damage, but meaningful nonetheless. Maddie was among the first to step forward, sitting down with the university's internal review board to describe in careful detail the weeks of small cruelties she'd watched Bradley inflict, comments in dining halls, whispered rumors in dormitory hallways. Moments she admitted she should have challenged more loudly at the time. I told myself it wasn't my fight, Maddie said quietly during her statement. I think a lot of us told ourselves that. I regret it more than I can say. Ruth gave a similar count, as did the student trainer from the gymnasium. And even Cole, Bradley's own friend, who described the uneasy conversation from earlier that week with visible discomfort. I should have said something sooner, Cole admitted. I think honestly, a part of me always knew something wasn't right about how he treated her. I just didn't want to lose my place in his circle by saying so out loud. Whitfield compiled every statement carefully, building a complete record not just of the falsified scholarship documents, but of the slow, cumulative pattern of harassment that had preceded them. It became, in its own quiet way, a lesson the entire campus seemed to absorb together, that silence, however comfortable, carries its own kind of cost. The king offered more than once to bring Josie and Eleanor back to Aldheim, to a life of comfort and security neither of them had ever known. Josie thought about it seriously for several long days. The week after the gala, before making her final decision, Josie found herself once more outside the counseling center, and once more Dr. Patterson welcomed her in with the same warm, unhurried patience. I imagine your week has been eventful, Dr. Patterson said, a small, kind smile tugging at her mouth. That might be the understatement of the year, Josie said, managing a tired laugh. She talked for a long while about the hearing, about the gala, about a father she'd never known, suddenly standing in front of her, about a mother who had carried an entire hidden life, quietly, for 18 years, to protect her. How are you feeling underneath all of it? Dr. Patterson asked gently, once Josie had finished. Josie considered the question carefully. Overwhelmed, she said finally. Grateful. Angry sometimes that it took something this dramatic for people to finally believe me. And a little afraid, honestly, that none of this changes who I actually am, even though everyone suddenly seems to be looking at me differently. Does it change who you are? Dr. Patterson asked. No, Josie said slowly, surprising herself with how certain she felt saying it. I don't think it does. I'm still the same person who got on that bus 3 weeks ago. Then hold on to that, Dr. Patterson said. Titles and crowns and dramatic entrances make for a remarkable story, Josie. But they were never what made you worth defending in the first place. You were worth defending the day you arrived here, carrying one suitcase and nothing else. Everything since has simply been the world finally catching up to what was true all along. Josie left that office feeling for the first time in weeks something close to whole. She thought about that conversation often over the following days, and it was Dr. Patterson's words, more than anything the king himself had offered her, that ultimately settled her decision to stay. In the end, she chose to remain at Ashford. "I earned my place here," she told her father, sitting together on a quiet bench overlooking the same quad where Bradley had once mocked her on her very first afternoon. "I want to finish what I started, as myself, not as anyone's daughter, not yet, just as Josie." The king studied her for a long moment, something like deep, proud understanding settling across his features. "Your mother said almost exactly those words to me once," he said softly. 18 years ago, standing on a coastline very far from here." "Maybe I get that from her," Josie said. "I believe you do," the king said, "and I could not be more grateful for it." On his last afternoon before returning to Aldheim, the king found Josie sitting alone near the fountain at the center of campus, turning the old silver pendant slowly between her fingers. "I want you to have something," he said, sitting down beside her, withdrawing a small worn velvet box from inside his jacket. Inside sat a delicate silver chain, matching the pendant she already wore, designed to let her wear both pieces together, joined finally after 18 years apart. "Your mother's half," he said quietly, "and mine, whole again exactly the way they were always meant to be." Josie fastened the chain with careful hands, feeling the small familiar weight settle against her collarbone, transformed now into something entirely different than it had been 3 weeks earlier. It was no longer in her mind an object of shame, something a cruel boy had once tried to mock into meaninglessness. It had become instead exactly what her mother had always quietly known it to be. Proof of love that had survived 18 years of silence, patience, and sacrifice, waiting faithfully for the right moment to finally come home. Higgins found Josie later that same evening, standing near the north gate where they had first met, watching the sun set slowly behind Ashford's old stone buildings. "Your father tells me you're staying," Higgins said, coming to stand beside her. "Someone told me once," Josie said, smiling slightly, "that dignity doesn't need an audience. I think I finally understand what that means." Higgins allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "Your mother used to say something similar," he said, "about service, about worth. I think the two of you have always understood something most people spend their whole lives trying to learn." "What's that?" Josie asked. "That real strength was never about being seen," Higgins said quietly. "It's about staying true to yourself, especially in the moments nobody's watching at all." They stood together a while longer in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade slowly across the quad, exactly where this entire story had begun, 3 difficult, transformative weeks earlier. A girl who arrived alone, carrying one suitcase and a pendant she didn't yet understand. A boy who mocked her, certain that cruelty was the same thing as power. And a truth patient and unshakable that had waited 18 quiet years for exactly the right moment to finally fully come home. That evening, as the campus lights flickered on, one by one across the quad, Josie thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the humiliation, the long nights of doubt, and the extraordinary, unimaginable turn her life had taken in the span of a single, impossible day. She thought about her mother's quiet strength carried silently for 18 years without complaint. She thought about Higgins standing watch over a promise he'd made decades ago and never once abandoned. She thought about a father who had crossed an ocean the moment he finally understood the truth, refusing to wait one single day longer than necessary. And she understood finally something worth remembering long after this particular story ends. The people who try hardest to make others feel small are rarely as powerful as they pretend to be. And the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who choose dignity over noise, even when nobody is watching, are very often stronger than anyone around them ever realized. Kindness, it turns out, always needs protectors. Sometimes those protectors arrive quickly. Sometimes they take 18 years. But if the cause is worth protecting, they always eventually come home. There is one more small piece of this story worth telling, quieter than the rest, but perhaps just as important. Months later, long after the scandal had faded from campus conversation, Josie received an unexpected letter forwarded through the university's administrative office. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, almost hesitant. It was from Bradley. He had spent the month since his expulsion working for the first time in his life. An ordinary job at a hardware store, 2 towns from his family's estate and arrangement his father had reluctantly agreed to after their business reputation collapsed entirely. It was, Bradley admitted in the letter, the first job he'd ever had to actually show up for the first place where nobody cared whose name he carried. "I'm not writing this expecting forgiveness," the letter read. "I don't think I've earned that yet, and maybe I never fully will. I just wanted you to know that I understand now, in a way I clearly didn't before, exactly how much harm I caused. Not just to you, to your mother, to people I'll probably never even know I hurt along the way. I used to think strength meant never being questioned, never being embarrassed. I think I understand now that real strength looked like you. Walking across that quad every single day, refusing to become smaller no matter what I threw at you. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't undo anything, but I wanted you to hear it clearly from me." Josie read the letter twice, sitting alone on the same bench near the fountain where her father had once given her the second half of her pendant. She didn't write back right away. Some wounds, she understood now, deserved time before forgiveness arrived, if it arrived at all. But she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer where she kept her mother's old photographs. A small imperfect proof that even the cruelest beginnings sometimes eventually gave way to something a little more honest. It wasn't redemption, not exactly. But it was perhaps a start. And sometimes this story seems to suggest a start is enough. If you have made it this far, perhaps you already know someone quiet in your own life. A neighbor who never mentions their own struggles. A grandchild carrying more than they let on. A co-worker who arrives early, leaves late, and never once asks for recognition. This story was never really about crowns or kingdoms or motorcades pulling into a quiet college courtyard. It was about the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who choose dignity over noise again and again, long before anyone thinks to notice. They deserve protecting too. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to look a little closer and see them clearly, long before the rest of the world finally catches up.